to that. Hello, YouTube. It is a DADCAW video format actually being used this time, although it's just for my face and the overlay down there somewhere. So check that out, I guess. Obviously, the overlay is something I whipped up very quickly so that I could have something other than my face on here, but also so that I could remind myself what the topic is, because sometimes I forget, as you'll no doubt understand automatically without me needing to say anything if you've listened to DADCAWs before. I don't expect people to watch DADCAWs now that my face is on it, but maybe as soon as you click on it, there'll be like 30 seconds where you're actually paying attention or something. And maybe that'll be enough time for me to launch into the topic at hand, and maybe that'll improve something. At the very least, it's more experience for me speaking into a camera, staring into a camera while I speak. And that's what we're doing here, folks. That's what we're doing here. But I wanted to talk a little bit about something that is a little bit different, a little bit something I'm not quite used to talking about, which is something that I actually brought up in the very first DADCAW that I ever made, which was time management, but also the main point of the DADCAW series, which was, of course, to improve my ability to speak and to collect my thoughts and to turn them into actual content that could at least be understood by the general public. And in that particular field, trying to make my words more intelligible to the average listener, I do think that I've come, I don't know if it's a long way or if it's been really small growth, but I do think there has been some growth. If you go back and listen to some of those old DADCAWs, unless there was a particular moment in time where I was really feeling it, and I was really turned on in that particular point in time, I was really on my game, most of the time it was kind of meandering. It's kind of boring, kind of disengaged, a little bit more so than I am right now, a little bit more so than I have been lately. And that is a victory in my book. And that's sort of the jumping off point for today's topic. Today's DADCAW is about evaluating progress. It's because I've been working on all these interviews and producing shows in the interim in the last couple of weeks to months on the second channel and elsewhere. Obviously, recently put out a Peaker's Advantage podcast for the first time in a very long time as the producer for that particular endeavor. And I've also been the producer for It's Server Time, which is Maui Snake's podcast, a talk show. Really, it's a talk show. I don't know why everybody calls everything a fucking podcast. People call my interview show a podcast. Apparently, if it's even though there's video format, which kind of stops it from becoming a podcast, just the way that it's used in common parlance now means that everything is a fucking podcast. So enjoy that. But outside of that little distinction, I have been quite busy making content for sure. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there's been a real push from myself to really try to like mine people's feedback to the point where I can actually get something of value out of it and try to improve as quickly as possible. Now, with producing, I've sort of been doing that for a while, since I believe midway through last year is when I was picked up as part of Peaker's Advantage and went through some growing pains. A lot of the overlays and stuff were pretty ugly to look at now, pretty avant-garde, and now it's much more simple, much more elegant. But even that, going back to it from the Server Time talk show overlays that I put together and from my own talk show overlays that Veek has educated me on, Veek has definitely been very helpful in that regard, and somebody who essentially inspired or taught me a lot of the things that I ended up using for the overlay for It's Server Time. In that sense, we're going at it in a very plain and clean fashion. We're trying to make things relatively simple and elegant, and even that is like a big level up in terms of usability for me as a producer. It's much easier for me to align cameras and change position of things in something like the It's Server Time overlay than the Peaker's Advantage overlay. And that's something that the Peaker's Advantage overlay can easily benefit from. I can easily do it, but just by virtue of not having done a podcast in that particular space in a while, having not actually done an episode of that particular talk show in a long time, it took me a little bit before I could comfortably say, hey, this is some content. This is an overlay for this piece of content that I can actually use, right? It took me a sec to realize, wow, I've actually been able to make stuff that's way better than this in terms of just sheer usability. So evaluating progress just in something as mundane as creating an overlay for a talk show and actually using it as the producer is one of those cases where I definitely would save myself some work with by using the skills and putting to work the lessons that I've learned doing the work since then. So it's definitely been interesting. It's been a really cool experience to look back on that stuff and potentially see how all that is coming together. It's definitely something that I want to continue working on. I want to continue improving. And when it comes to the interview side of things, the fact that I've been able to not only draw the attention of some pretty big name guests, Thorin, Richard Lewis, Launders, just to name a few, just essentially from humble beginnings, leveraging the fact that I have a connection with Davey and Maui Snake from doing the Peakers Advantage talk show and doing that producing job, and turning that into something where I can have them essentially kickstart the channel with their name value because we've got a personal relationship that's been built up over enough time. That was something that I could segue into getting the attention of some bigger name people. And, by virtue of, for example, Maui Snake being an analyst at events that Thorin is at, I was able to get the attention of Thorin. And then through the Thorin interview itself, I was able to get the attention of Richard Lewis. And through both of those guys adding legitimacy to my platform, I think I received a shout out on a recent By the Numbers as a result, which is, if you don't know anything about this space, because usually the videos on this channel are much more focused on like Brood War content and stuff. But if you don't know anything about this space, that is a big talk show. That is the quintessential Counter-Strike podcast is what they call it, which again, it's a fucking talk show, but who cares? It's fine. So that's the quintessential talk show for the space. It gets 2,000 to 3,000, sometimes more live viewers every time they go live with it. And obviously many more thousands of views are on their VODs that are uploaded to Richard Lewis's YouTube channel. And so in a situation like that, where, my platform has been given legitimacy by virtue of guests who I was able to gain access to sort of like really in a way that I feel like it was happening very, very fast. I think it was something like the fifth or sixth interview I did period was with Thorin. And the idea that that's going to happen, like I've just now clocked in my 10th interview on that channel in terms of semi-pro interviews, not counting the Hammer Made Anvil ones, but even then you count that and then it's just 14. I've done 14 interviews period, right? No matter what the distinction is of the genre or the subject matter. I've done 14 interviews in my whole life when it comes to esports, and 2 of them have been with some of the biggest name guests that you could possibly get, the biggest personalities, the biggest broadcast talents, and the people who add a lot of value to the scene with their content, the biggest content producers in the space. And that's to say nothing of the fact that I also had Vu on, who's a really, really big name content creator for the the enthusiast side who want to get better at the game and are searching for improvement. Like that's somebody that they go to. The next step up on that would be like War Owl or 3 Clicks Phillip, who I'm sure many people are aware of, even if they don't closely follow the scene of Counter-Strike itself. So, in theory, being able to segue up the ladder in that way and sort of parlay any experience I have with some of these guests to these other situations, it's been a real interesting experience. I'll put it to you that way. It's been one of those cases where, because of the fact that I was willing to send the message in the first place to, via DMs to some of these people like Thorin and Richard Lewis, the fact that I was able to reach out to Launders and reach out to Hawka and so on and so forth, like all these people who make really, really good, high quality analytical content or esports content, or they're on talk shows, and these people are in the public consciousness. They've been people whose content I have consumed for years. And the idea that I'm actually at that point, I mean, you almost have to evaluate that as a separate kind of progress. Like, holy shit, like, how did I get here, right? Like, I'm actually asking the, hey, how did I get here question, which I believe was the title of the last Big Boys table. Rest in peace. So, yeah, it's been a real journey just in the last month or two. It's been really cool to see that. So, yeah, I mean, in a situation where my platform being given legitimacy is the main point that I was trying to make before I got lost. And the fact is, I think that the content is high quality. I also think there's probably a lot of things I can improve upon. Some things I've already observed. Things like, for example, I'll give one particular example because I think it's something that I already did better when I did the very next episode of Semi-Pro. There was the 9th episode of Semi-Pro was with Richard Lewis, and at the end of the interview, I kind of gave him a really limp-dicked question, asking him to essentially summarize any last thoughts he had. Or it's like the catch-all, like being very safe. Are there any topics we didn't discuss that you want to broach? Which kind of puts the responsibility of asking the question or broaching a topic on the interviewee, which is really not what you're supposed to do, right? So I thought that was like, a blemish on an otherwise pretty solid episode of that interview show, a pretty solid interview all around. And that could have been a really interesting, compelling capstone question where you turn the reins over to the guest, but in a way where you are still dictating the realm that you're asking them to discuss, the topic that you're asking them to discuss. You're saying, maybe, an approach that I could have taken is, since we were talking about match fixing in a lower tier North American context for Counter-Strike, I could have said, like, Do you spoke about this earlier? Do you have any final message for anybody who might be match fixing right now, or was considering it, or simply apologizes for the behavior and thinks that it's okay and understandable? Is there a message that you have for people who sympathize with those people? Is there anything that comes to your mind on that topic, or something like that? It would have been a nice capstone to the whole show. Would have wrapped everything up. Would have allowed Richard Lewis to restate some of his opinions, incendiary or otherwise, in a way that would have, I think, made for a compelling closing point. And yeah, so generally speaking, I think that would have been a better approach. And that's exactly what I did with the Elfish Guy interview, which I dropped earlier today, where I asked him, going full circle back to the very first question I had asked him, I basically allowed him to summarize his thoughts again and try to like push that point, because the first question in that particular case was, how do you get people interested in a scene that is seen as downtrodden or less than some of the bigger scenes out there that just doesn't have as many people watching it or playing in it or whatever. And getting him to sort of restate that added a sense of purpose to the entire interview, especially since we started with that. It was a nice way to like come full circle. Now, not all interviews will have an easy get out of jail free card in that respect, where you can close out the interview in a very compelling and satisfying manner and come full circle in that sense. So sometimes I'll have to work a little bit harder on it. But as far as I'm concerned, that was a compelling way to close everything out. So generally speaking, I'm quite happy with that. I do think that the way things have gone, I'm very certain that things will continue to improve. And the fact that I was able to triage that issue, that admittedly did come on the highest viewed video on that particular channel as of the time of this recording, you know, I could have picked a different interviewee to get that, to make that mistake to such a level that I could have observed it, right? In theory, maybe I could have made that mistake on somebody who was lower profile or whatever, but I don't really have that many regrets for that, because I mean, I think maybe the fact that it was a bigger name guest, even that made me think a little bit harder about any potential mistakes I may have made. And so maybe if it was with somebody lesser, maybe I'm pretty sure I've made that kind of limp-dicked mistake in the past with other guests. And maybe the fact that they weren't a Thorin or Richard Lewis may have resulted in me not really looking at it to the same degree and not really giving it the same amount of gravity and really considering what I could do to fix it in the same way. So that the next time I have a guest of that caliber or that very same guest back on the show to talk about something, I can come at you with a better closing question. Because of the fact that it wasn't really the same level of guest or whatever you want to call it. Maybe that had something to do with it. So those are just some of my thoughts on evaluating progress. I do think that if we have to really look at how things have gone in the past year or since I started the DADCAW series, which I believe was either very, very late 2019 or very, very early 2020, I've definitely come a long way with not just on-camera presence, which obviously is a bit more recent, because while I've been mod streaming pretty regularly, I think every single mod stream has had a camera for this year-long streak that we're in, I believe. I'm not 100% sure. But with that said, I do think that there's a pretty big consideration to be made that beyond the on-camera stuff, just the fact that I've been able to focus so heavily on being able to state my opinion and not really stutter nearly as much. Of course, I say that stuttering, but whatever. You get the idea. Not being able to just get drawn away by various thoughts in the middle of trying to make a point. I definitely think I've improved a lot on the meandering nature of some of my thoughts and some of the way that I just speak when I'm trying to produce content. So the goal is not necessarily to always sound like you're reading off of a script. The goal is not necessarily to sound like you've become super prepared and that you've written every idea out, because it doesn't really sound natural. And there is an element where I believe that if you can bullet point some stuff to remind yourself what you're talking about, something like what the Thorin's Thoughts series actually is, if you're ever familiar with that or you want to go and look up some of those examples. A lot of the content that Thorin puts out in that vein, a lot of the content that Richard Lewis puts out in that vein, where he's doing a more journalistic reports or opinion pieces on certain events, I guarantee you they don't script everything out. They have some bullet points. They know what the news is. They also know what their own voice is and what their own opinions are. So the idea is to start out with maybe some game reviews, like the upcoming Batman Arkham Knight review that I've got coming, and to do something similar to that, and essentially do what I'm doing right now with the DADCAW. Like, it should get to this point where I can comfortably riff on whatever the topic is, because I've considered some ideas and I've written out some bullet points. I didn't for this one, but I've written out some bullet points about what to consider, or maybe some note that I want to make sure that I highlight or push, or some idea that I want to make damn sure is understood from the get-go. you know, the idea that from now on is to take DADCAW in that route, where I'm getting more familiar with speaking into a camera and doing Thorin's Thoughts or Richard Lewis style videos in that sense, where I can just speak and be on camera and have a very simple, clean overlay that probably will take up even less space than this one currently does once somebody is done with it. I don't know if Eek will see this and be like, this is a fucking terrible overlay. Must change it, because that's what's happened in the last couple of times, which I appreciate, honestly. Like, he's a self-starter in that sense. He just sees what he doesn't like and he goes for it. So endless thanks to that man. But for me, I just wanted to get the content out there. Better out there and imperfect than never out there, because that it also never gets perfect that way. So anyway, that side tangents aside, the plan is now taking this DADCAW thing into a new sort of era, if you will, getting on camera, doing that sort of thing, and using this as a way to fashion my skills in that manner, where I can speak into a camera with minimal prep. I mean, prep in the sense that I've played the game that I'm game reviewing. I've done whatever the due diligence is there. And beyond that, I can just say what I actually think and feel. And I've discovered my voice enough that I'm pretty confident in my ability to do that without too much stuttering, without too much of anything. So that's the plan going forward. There's going to be a couple of content announcements after the Batman video is done. Not sure, depending on the time, it might end up happening as an opening to the next month's channel map or something like that. But for the most part, I do believe that we're staring down the barrel of a very exciting time for video content on this very channel, especially since the mod stream streak, the compulsory 2, 3, 4 hour mod streams are going to be going the way of the dodo at some point after the year-long streak concludes on the 3rd of November, which is conveniently also the time where the map crap stuff concludes as well. So a lot of what's eating up a good portion of the time that I could be using to record videos for this channel or to stream gameplay, let's play stuff on this channel, a large portion of the content that's pushed in that regard is not going to be still on my daily task sheet in the same way. Obviously, we're going to be getting started on the new engine development at some point soon, but that's more or less what I've got for you. So some very exciting stuff planned, and obviously more content on the other channel planned. And we'll just see where this crazy train takes us. Really, life has been looking pretty fucking good from the crow's eye view. So thanks very much for hanging with me on this very strange but ultimately epic journey. And I'll catch you guys more often in person or in face or whatever the fuck you call this in the future for every DADCAW, every game review. And I've got another series that I'll end up starting that will, at least for now, take the place of By Design, but be a little bit more regular, precisely because I don't have to script everything out in the same way that I was talking about. But more on that later. For now, let's just sit back and enjoy the fact that we've evaluated our progress on this DADCAW, and I'll catch you later on.